Everything that is currently being propagated by the media and politics is used to inject the experimental gene cocktail into every person on Earth, in order to achieve a high vaccination rate. A part of the population that can be manipulated by fear is mobilized to voluntarily inject initial, booster or update vaccinations. The other part of the population, which for various conclusive and understandable reasons decides against the injection of the experimental gene cocktail and thus against a profitable prophylactic therapy for the entire population, is forced to the gene cocktail injection through pressure and compulsion. The measures that are already being carried out worldwide or are planned in the near future to literally inject the experimental gene cocktail into the arms of the world population and how a large part of humanity has been misled and is being forced to be driven into the vaccination centers are explained, analyzed and recorded here. Point 1. Fear of creating a harmless pathogen or its consequences, known as long COVID, for most people. Point 2. Political harassment through new laws that exclude people from social life and bring them into existential hardship. Point 3. Create a social climate hostile to the unvaccinated. Point 4. Unnecessary harassment through insane and barely achievable health requirements in everyday life. Point 5. Making the unvaccinated in society visible. Point 6. Suppression of opposition, other opinions and dissenting voices. It is said that there is only real science. Point 7. Material and financial incentives, some of which are highly absurd, are set to get people to use gene cocktail injections, under panic hypnosis for injection, in order to ensure that the first rush to the vaccination centers. Many people feared a harmless pathogen or its sequela, called long COVID, alien to reality, but existential fears for most people. Of course, a pandemic has to be created first. This does not mean that a virus was released, even though that is in the room, but that the population was deliberately panicked, maybe even with the story about a virus that was released. How did the pandemic come about? The first step in creating a pandemic was that the WHO redefined the term pandemic. It was only because of this that the corona pandemic could be described as such. There can be no pandemic if no one is diagnosed with disease, so the PCR test was introduced as the gold standard to detect the new disease. Suddenly, people who are healthy were considered sick and were accused of having a virus. The introduction of the PCR test as a diagnostic tool was also carried out by the WHO. This diagnostic tool was not developed by the German virologist Christian Drosten as reported by the media. But Drosten just already has it. Existing test procedures have been adapted so that it searches for the virus sequence of the coronavirus that has not yet been isolated. An impossible scenario in normal times. The history of the corona PCR test is extremely bizarre and questionable. The PCR test is not a suitable one diagnostic tool to determine an infection. What the PCR test detects is a possible virus sequence, that of a computer, and which is the result of a few lungs, a lot of imagination and an ICQ conversation between Professor Christian Drosten and a few other scientists. The coronavirus has never been isolated and control experiments have never shown that it causes any type of disease. At the time of the swine flu, Christian Drosten was also largely responsible for the panic created at that time and the resulting administration of the vaccine against swine flu and the resulting vaccine damage and long-term consequences. Although Christian Drosten has repeatedly attracted attention with absurd statements and prognoses, none of which have even come close, Drosten has remained the virologist who sets the tone in Germany. Although Drosten is a virologist, he was awarded a journalism award, at the handover of which he calls for the silence of journalists in his laudation who hold a different opinion and who do not move within the narrative and opinion corridor he calls for. In his eulogy for his award, Drosten through the flower announces that journalists who do not like I'm asked to report to him that he's even a potential murderer. Christian Drosten has a great interest in ensuring that journalists do not deviate from their attitude journalism, so that they do not at some point address his false prognoses, and also not Drosten as a person as a questionable pandemic profiteer with his also very questionable history. Such is his connection to one of the most powerful and richest family in Germany and the world, which has existed for a long time, and Drosten has often opened doors. This is the Quandt family. Since the so-called pandemic is a worldwide phenomenon, every country has its own questionable folk virologist, whose instructions the population should follow and whom the media will not speak badly about. In America that would be Dr. Anthony Fauci, who shares a similar history as Christian Drosten and who was also noticed by crude statements, false prognoses, and the cutting out of the vocal cords of laboratory dogs because they barked too loudly for him. At the time of the test adjustment by Drosten, there was no reason at all for it, as no pandemic had occurred or emerged at all up to that point in time. The inventor and Nobel Prize laureate of the PCR test has strongly warned against using the PCR test as a diagnostic tool for diseases, since the PCR test can be easily manipulated through so-called cycles and, to put it mildly, can detect everything in the human body, if the test is repeated enough times. If a gene strand existed from extraterrestrial flying earthworms, which actually only fly because no gravity exists and one is looking for it, then the PCR test could also detect this in humans with a sufficient number of repetitions. Warning: maybe this is the alien invasion everyone is talking about. We only have to use the PCR test to detect extraterrestrial life by first having a computer calculate a possible gene strand of possible extraterrestrial life. Search for it with the PCR test and we have humans infected by extraterrestrials. The PCR test is also used to detect HIV. Due to the continuous panic loop created by the media, many media consumers could be mobilized at the beginning of the vaccination campaign, who voluntarily and pragmatically let themselves be carried away to have an injection administered. Since the coronavirus is harmless for most people, panic was also spread over an alleged long-term consequence of corona called long COVID, and its dramatic impact on the lives of those affected. In order to persuade people to use the experimental gene cocktail injections, new studies and findings indicate that long COVID and its vaguely defined symptoms are psychosomatic symptoms, which many sufferers could only imagine and which are also triggered by other illnesses or the corona protective measures could become. It can hardly be denied that the corona protective measures and its direct consequences can trigger the disease known as long COVID. The mere improper use of the completely senseless face masks that are imposed on us and declared as protection against the virus can have massive physical and psychological effect. Handling problems are wearing the face masks for a longer period of time, which the manufacturer specifies is harmless. Worn masks are not regularly replaced with new ones. The incorrect and unhygienic use of the mask. The masks are often stuck with unwashed hands from the glove compartment to the pocket and then back onto the face. As a result of this unsanitary use of the masks, the wearer breathes in unhygienic air of poor quality and composition, in addition to the viruses, bacteria and fungi and dirt that accumulates in the mask. That alone could lead to long COVID symptoms such as weakness, difficulty breathing and fatigue. The psychological effects of the face mask. Man is a social being. The so-called protective masks make communication, interpersonal relationships, as well as the recognition of facial expressions and mood in the faces of other people difficult or prevented. The smile, incidentally or spontaneous conversations with unknown people has been lost. The masks create a climate of fear. The subconscious is suggested that all other people in the vicinity are frightened and gives the impression that the situation and environment are threatening. Fear and panic and preventing basic human needs such as communication, recognizing facial expressions of the other person and thus the Z. Interpersonal, may not be good for the mental health and welfare of society. In addition, every person is forced to wear a so-called protective mask in the company of other people. This compulsion, contrary to his personal judgment as to whether such a mask is good for his own health or not, forces people to permanently act contrary to their own personal judgment and to inflict physical harm on themselves. At the same time, a contempt for a society begins that forces people to behave in a self-destructive manner and encourages them to do so. Everyone is forced to look like paranoid idiots who ignore or don't seem to understand all scientific fact. Without coercion, no one would allow himself to be carried away into this absurd and nonsensical behavior. The virus is much smaller than the membrane of the mask. You protect yourself against the virus with the mask that is imposed on you just as well as someone who tries to stop mosquitoes with a chain link fence. Minds about masks also changed dramatically over the course of the pandemic. As long as there were no masks in stock, they were not propagated by politics or the media. Even the German corona pope and virologist Christian Drosten, who was instrumental in promoting the pandemic and developing the questionable PCR test, said in a television interview that the technical data of the masks do not look good to deal with to protect against a virus. There is no protective effect and a lot of negative side effects and therefore no justification for wearing a so-called protective mask. After many politicians had concluded overpriced mask deals and a lot of tax money in the pockets of acquaintances, sons of politicians, companies of politician wives and in the pockets of politicians themselves, the masks were suddenly vital and the mask requirement was introduced in many areas of life. In order to prepare the population for the so-called protective masks made by children's hands and on the floor. It was suggested shortly before the masks were delivered from China that they should hang self-sewn and improvised, mostly foul-smelling rags on their faces. It seems that many people have not yet seen or understood what kind of equipment one needs to be equipped with in order to protect oneself from a virus. The key word is, full-body suit with its own oxygen supply. What the nice neighbor stuck together from old cleaning rags in her laundry room may be meant nicely, but not suitable for protecting yourself against a virus. It is hard to imagine that politicians and advocates of mask requirements do not know about the bad technical data and the negative health effects of so-called protective masks and everyday masks. In this case, too, in spite of the facts just mentioned, mask requirements are enforced in every country. Hardly anywhere else is another path tried than when the same agenda with protective masks is pursued worldwide. All over the world, politicians, scientists and journalists ignore scientific facts about the so-called protective masks, propagate the mask requirement and accept negative consequences for the population. Isn't it frightening that officially there is no other scientific opinion? There are no good arguments for the mask. The only thing the masks are good at is creating an environment of fear and reducing social interaction. Wearing unsanitary face masks and masks coated with viruses, bacteria and fungi are more likely to burden the respiratory tract, immune system and psyche of the population instead of protecting them. The positive thing about the masks is, in the best case, that you can easily recognize stupid and extremely state-minded people with fascist tendencies when the senseless and filthy mask is stuck over the nose at the best possible opportunity and, best of all, other of these blind idiots to wear will be prompted. Everyone is allowed to use as many masks as they want for their protection. But forcing others to do the same bullshit is more than revealing to me what kind of personalities we are dealing with. Although all so-called protective masks can actually be described as inferior when it comes to protection against viruses, the German health dictator Jens Spahn wanted to distribute particularly inferior masks among disabled and homeless people. At the same time, at the beginning of the pandemic, Spahn bought a huge villa for €4 million, which, however, has a market value of at least 20 million. Journalists who want to report on Jens Spann's villa purchase were warned by him.